Well, we have the wonderful Margaret Bennett with us today. I'm going to call her Margie. And what Margie does is very, very impressive. It's very fulfilling. It's something that we all need at one point of our lives because many times we don't even realize, but as children, a little something that happened actually became a traumatic instance for us that caused some wounds in a deep level of our subconscious that now keep driving our life in automatic without us realizing. So I absolutely admire the work that Maggie does. And here we have the beautiful Margaret Bennett. Welcome, Maggie.
Hi, Sandra. How are you today?
So good to have you here. I'm super excited to share your story with our audience and for them to see how magical it is what you do, and for them to realize that many times when things happen that keep occurring in automatic over and over again, we don't even realize why, and it must be because of a traumatic event that we decided to store in our subconscious as trauma. So Margie, tell us a little bit about yourself, who you are, and what's life been for you.
Okay. Well, as you said, Sandra, my name's Margie. I actually have set up a small business where I help both trauma survivors as well as clinicians who are trauma survivors to work more effectively with people. And the reason that I set that up is from years and years and years of being a clinician, and also years of over 30 years of actually setting up trauma services as well. But I guess to go back further, when I speak at conferences and I ask people a simple question, I say, hands up anyone in this room who has never experienced trauma themselves, or anyone in their family has never experienced trauma. And you know what? Never does anyone put their hand up. I mean, trauma is all part of everyone's life. And there's a lot of research, there's a lot of evidence that it does impact the way that people's brains grow, and it also does impact some of the choices we make later in life. And to give kind of some examples, my own life, I grew up in Scotland. I became an immigrant child. I was beaten and bullied up at school because I spoke funny. I didn't sort of speak the way that other people spoke in Australia. When my family came out here, I had left a very large extended family network in Scotland, and when we arrived here in Australia, it was just, my mum and dad and my sister and I. On the way to Australia, my mother's father had actually died, and he had told my mother that it would kill him if she took us away. So when we arrived in Australia, my mother became deeply depressed. My father was very angry and took to alcoholism in a way that he never had in Scotland. And so there was a lot of violence that I kind of grew up with. But the other side of all that is, I think that sometimes from the traumas that we have, we experience gifts and get to know ourselves in different ways. We get to know what we can survive. We get to know what we can, really do and really think for others. And I eventually went into the field of social work. I mean, I did have an inkling in my head that maybe I wanted to actually go into drama. But anyway, felt social work would be a more secure thing. Subsequently went into drama in the way that I developed some skills in psychodrama. I worked with people in America who developed a model of psychodrama for helping trauma survivors in particular, and that was a very exciting period of my career. And I also developed one of the first services in Australia for a particular group of trauma survivors. And I think that very often in the trauma field, there's not enough emphasis put on what's called post-traumatic growth, that people can survive trauma. Human beings have had trauma in their lives for generations. great achievements have been made in people's lives through the traumas that they've experienced. And I think that in the work that I do, I try to encourage both trauma survivors as well as the workers who work with them on how can you go beyond trauma? How can you thrive? And so that was the reason that I wrote the book, Thrive Beyond Trauma, which is a guidebook for trauma clinicians and the managers that manage them. But of course, you know, it also has particular ideas in it about how anyone can survive trauma. So that's a little bit of my story.
Nice.
On a more personal note, many of the trauma areas that I've worked in have had some personal impact on my life. For example, I worked for a period of time in missing persons, and that was at a time where one of my children had gone to visit her father for school holidays, and she was about 13 at the time, and I haven't seen her since. I haven't had contact with her since, and that's well over 10 years. I've didn't for many years even know whether she was in Australia. I've since learnt that she actually is in another country. I'm not able to visit her. I don't know where she is. And so the impact of that, you know, helped me to understand trauma in a different way in my body and in my being. I've worked in cancer spaces. I've worked in rape and domestic violence spaces. I've worked with refugees and asylum seekers. I've taught at university in health and human rights and subjects like that. And I think that, you know, once we're able to see the range of traumas we have in our lives, we're able to kind of pull them together into who am I as a person? What makes me strong? What makes me vulnerable? What makes me afraid some days? And these are all the ways that trauma impacts. In my book, I have this nice little kind of, not a saying, but I have the idea that the word trauma means that trust is impacted, that people often re-experience things over and over in their life as a result of the trauma, that people often become anxious, that some people you know, have unforeseen circumstances happen to them, their motivation goes down, they often experience loss and a sense of just that their life will never go well. I think it is possible for people to, you know, move beyond surviving to thriving. And I think how we do that is we need to learn to trust ourselves and other people. We need to, you know, find what hope we have in life. You know, I remember when I was a little girl at 3 or 4 or 5, I can't remember, I know it was before I was going to school, that I learned the word hope. And I don't know why I needed to learn that word at that time, but it was a thought that has kind of held me together throughout my life. There's always a tomorrow. There's always another breath that we can take to calm ourselves or to just have energy available to us from ourselves and other people. So that's hope. I think that we also need to kind of build our resilience. And sometimes people don't even know how to assess their resilience. They don't know they just know that I've just experienced this, and this. And I meet trauma workers who kind of feel a bit like they're a fraud because they've been trauma survivors themselves. In fact, you know, the fact that they can work with other people shows how resilient they are. And how we develop that resilience is through developing our insight into what's happened in our lives. And then moving on to, you know, what are my values? Not just the values that were put on me by my family or by my community, but what are the values that I have in my life that are going to power me to move forward? And also, I like to use, for the V word, I also like to use the concept of virtues, because our virtues are the way that we treat other people and not just how we want to be treated ourselves. And I think in our work or in our lives, we also need to kind of build in some excitement and some sustainability. And so those key areas are some of the ways that I work with the concept of moving beyond trauma into a place of being able to thrive. And what does this mean for ordinary people? Well, I think, many people who've experienced traumas, they do go to clinicians, they do go to psychologists, they go to social workers, they go to counsellors, they go to church ministers, they go to, other professional people that are going to provide them with support. I think it's really important that they kind of ask questions of their clinicians about, what models of trauma do you work with? Where did you get your learning about how to help someone who's been extremely traumatized? We know now that trauma does impact the brains of people. We know that particularly for children, their brains don't develop in the same way if they've had extensive traumas. And we know that there are many, many ways of bringing people's mind and body back into sync that kind of helps them with the range of emotions that they have as a result of traumas. And also, just being able to kind of, acknowledge to yourself how much sadness and loss you may have had as the result of growing up in the way that you did. Ask me a question, Sandra.
Absolutely. Just trying to unmute. So I love this, Margie, because first of all, thank you for sharing such deep stories. And second of all, you're right, especially those of us who are parents. Many times we have young children, and a small event or what might be like an insignificant event for ourselves actually causes trauma in their brains, and we don't realize. And as you said, Margie, just the ability to be able to talk it through, just to help the child and the adult process that situation to avoid it from creating that experience of trauma in their brain, or from healing it, because our brains are like muscles, they're very flexible, they stretch. And so once we talk it through, or someone helps us see that situation with a different perspective, with a different filter of the glass, then we're able to process it in a different way in our brain so that it doesn't get stored as trauma and affects our future. And
yes, and that you're absolutely right, Sandra. And I think that some of the things is that parents are often so busy they don't kind of realize the impact of their words. For example, I was working with a young girl who's a teenager who's become very, very anxious, and although she's achieving very well at school, she feels that she's a bit worthless as a person. And of course, teenagers go through that phase anyway. But one of the things that was fundamental to her, when I said to her, look, how long have you been feeling this way? It all kind of went back to a particular incident where her parents were fighting one night, and she got up out of bed, and she was only a little girl, she was very little, and under, certainly in primary school age group, but quite a small child, and had gone straight to sort of say to her parents, please stop fighting, I can't sleep, stop fighting. And her mother screamed at her and told her to get back to her bed, and she just felt so hurt and rejected when what she was wanting to do was just to help out in some way. And that has stayed with her for quite a long time, kind of broke something in the relationship between her and her mother, which, all teenage girls need their mums. They might argue a bit more with their mums when they're going through that stitch, but they still need to be able to kind of take the best of each parent as well as know themselves. I think sometimes with other clients, it might be not only just talking about things, but helping clients to breathe in a different way. Now, that sounds very funny. We all kind of think that we breathe the right way. But often I find that trauma survivors are unable to breathe in right down into their diaphragm in a way that's very nourishing for their brain and their body. And what happens when people breathe in a very shallow way, we now know that sets off a part of our brain to become more anxious. And so even just reteaching trauma survivors how to breathe, how to count their breath so that they have a long, slow out breath, that they might take in a breath to 1, 2, 3, 4, hold it for a second, but allow it to just leave their body in a very slow way to the count of 8. Doing that 4 to 6 times, people kind of say, people in my office go, oh, I feel really different. Oh, I feel calm for the first time. And it's such a simple thing, and we don't think about it very often when we're rushing around. But the long, slow out breath allows the part of our brain that switches on, the part of our nervous system that goes, the world is okay, just calm, it's all right, is actually a very beneficial thing. So there's many ways of talking, of breathing. I mean, we also know there's a whole lot of information coming out in the world of nutrition about, changes that we can make in the kind of foods we eat can impact, a sense of anxiety in the world and depression. And all of these, are important when you're working with trauma survivors.
I love that, Maggie, because breathing is a great skill we can also start teaching kids from a young age, whether we're parents or not, like from a school or nieces, nephews or whatever, because I noticed, for example, one of my daughters, the oldest, like her threshold for stress is small. And so little things will stress her a lot. And what happens is that if I feel responsible as a mother, if I don't teach her the breathing tools and things for her to calm herself down, then those stressful situations can become trauma in her head because of the way they are processed. And I know I had to teach myself that whenever I get triggered with a situation and I'm like about to go into a reactive mode, if I just remember to slow down and breathe, then by putting that extra oxygen in my brain, I can all of a sudden perceive that situation from a completely different angle. Now,
absolutely.
Thank you, Maggie. Now, if you're wondering what your level of trauma or someone that you love is, I guess if you don't have it yet, you can go and get Maggie's amazing book, Thrive Beyond Traumas, and you can head straight over to page 31, where it's chapter 4, and you can actually, there's an assessment for trauma so that you can see, if a certain situation happened over the last 12 months, how stressful was it for you? And then you get to score it. Because what happens for Maggie and the way she perceives it may be completely different to the way I perceive it, depending on our threshold for handling stress. If something happened with my kids right now, I probably wouldn't be able to cope anywhere near as well as Maggie could, just because of what she has been through already. Or it can be a complete irrelevant topic, but you've probably been through a lot of very traumatic or stressful situations in your life. So your muscle, that is that threshold for handling stress, has stretched out, so that you can tolerate things at a higher level that probably for other people would cause trauma because they haven't been through a lot. So that muscle is not as stretched out for them. And, that's some of the things that I explained here. Resilience, what Margie said. Again, if you haven't been throwing many balls at you throughout your life, your level of resilience is probably lower. So you give up easier. when people that have been through a lot of difficult situations in their life, the level of resilience is much bigger, which means they can put up with more, they can handle more. And it's only because they have worked out that muscle called resilience more because of what has been thrown at them. Is that right, Margie?
Well, it's partly true. I think that happens for some people, but there's also quite a bit of research that can kind of that also kind of says that we also have our own sort of internal threshold for how much we can cope with. And sometimes the kind of person that's coped and coped and coped and coped and coped, suddenly one day, suddenly starts having, you know, nightmares or difficulty sleeping or feeling anxious or getting depressed, and they're not really clear what it's all about. And it often links back to having had to cope all the time, that they've not ever learned to kind of be vulnerable. And I think we also need to kind of remember, Sandra, about that sometimes some of the traumas we've had happened to us at times when we were pre-verbal. Like, I know for my own self that you know, my mother at one stage, for a range of reasons, put me into an orphanage for a period of time, you know. And although my mother kind of used to always say to me, oh look, that it was only for a few weeks, in my body it felt like much longer, you know. And you know, we know that a lot of pre-verbal trauma can impact as well. One of my own grandchildren very recently, at 4 weeks of age, had major heart surgery, and she was tied up to tubes, and you know, it's very distressing for our whole family. She's home now, and the operation, you know, is successful. But when I went to see her a few weeks ago, you know, I was talking with my daughter about, you know, ways to help her feel safe. You know, for example, lying her down on her back, or it's going to, or on the way that she was on the operating table, is going to trigger trauma memory in her brain. And so, you know, the role for my daughter's family is to help her to feel safe. Now, what's the safest way for a baby to feel? Being held close to your heart. And all of these help develop new neural pathways. We do know that the brain is what we call very, got high levels of what's called neuroplasticity, that when years ago we used to think that you learned something and that was it, we now know that new neural pathways can be made. So if you have a neural pathway that gears you to kind of attracting trauma into your life, or a neural pathway that kind of says, I'll never be loved, and that's the thought that you're mostly putting out there in the world, we do know that by changing that thought, we do know that kind of feeling it differently in your body can create new neural pathways. And that's what some of the current work in trauma is all about, is because you have to remember that the trauma memories that we have, they kind of got into our body through our senses. You know, sights can trigger us, smells can trigger us, taste can trigger us, just how we felt in a particular situation can trigger us, because the trauma memory gets laid down in our brain and our bodies through our senses. And so coming to an understanding of, you know, how you get triggered, what triggers you, what it's about, how to change it, what new kind of sensory experiences to give yourself that can counteract it, can be all very helpful for both, you know, children and adults.
I love the way you explain it, Margie. And I love, if you have a look at Margie's book on page 91, it's asking questions about, you know, how do you describe your coping skills? Because as Margie said, some of us have it stronger than others. How balanced is your eating plan? Because as Margie said, if you're not taking care of your nutrition, then everything else declines, including your coping skills, your resilience, and the way you process the situations. your energy. How could you increase your energy so that you have more of those reserves to be able to cope with the stress? How much sleep do you have? I know for me, and as females, oh my God, if I can go without eating or without anything else, but if I don't sleep enough, everything seems 10 times worse than it is. You know, there might be a drop of rain and all of a sudden it looks like a storm to me. But I've learned to become aware of what works for my body. You know, for some people, they might be able to go without a sleep longer, but not without food. I'm the opposite. So I know that if the world is looking a little cloudy and gray out there, Sandra needs a little sleep so that I can wake up and see the day more sunny and positive out there. So it's those little things that make a big difference. Exercising and, you know, your hygiene. Again, if I don't exercise, I know that I start to feel more stress, more short temper. So my threshold starts to, you know, go down. So I know that as soon as I go for a little run or just a 15-20 minute workout, all of a sudden I start producing more of those happy chemicals in my brain. So I start to feel more like, oh, I'm invincible, I can do this. When 10 years before I went to exercise, I didn't feel that way. So it's being aware and taking care of ourselves, right, Margie?
Yes. Oh, it is. And I think, you know, for people who are in roles that are helping people a lot. Now, I guess most of my book is aimed at trauma clinicians themselves who are trauma survivors. But, you know, there are lots of people who do volunteer work with trauma survivors. There are lots of entrepreneurs who do things for people less fortunate than themselves, who often witness you know, experiences that are outside the realm of their normal experience, and they find it shocking to them. And I think that sometimes in organizations, if you're in an organization that kind of works with trauma survivors a lot, like, it sounds sensible, but often it doesn't happen, that the actual climate of the organization you work in, you know, affects your capacity to manage traumas in your life. For example, if you're being bullied in the workplace and you were bullied as a child at school, over time that's going to impact you. And I think it's really important to be able to find a way of addressing these things, both in organizations as well as in our families and our communities.
I love what you said, Maggie. I remember when I was in primary school, I had my little group of friends, and you know, we can be quite cruel sometimes without realizing.
Yes, yes.
I'll never forget, but one day, for some reason, we didn't wear uniform. We must have had an event going on at a school, and I was wearing this gorgeous dress my mom had given me, which was like stripes of pink and white. You know, pink is my favorite color and was since then. And then it was a little cool that day, and so I had these shoes that were slightly open, like with the straps as well. And so my mom said, just put some stockings underneath to keep you warm. So I put these beautiful pink stockings underneath, or white, I think, I can't remember. But I remember, wow, I look very elegant. I look so pretty, you know. I get to school and I see all my friends staring at me, checking me up and down and secreting. And, you know, at first I'm like, oh my God, I must look so pretty. Like, they just can't stop, you know, talking about it, until I realized, oh, actually, that's not what they're saying. And they were actually criticizing me for wearing stockings with shoes that are not fully closed, that they had, you know, strappies. And I'll never forget, such a, what you might think as an adult silly incident caused such a deep wound. Like, I felt so bullied and insecure. And, you know, from there on, I would just question every time before I got dressed, when we didn't have to wear uniform, you know, what should I put on that I'm not going to be criticized? And even if my mom went to visit me to school, I was worried to see, what is she wearing today? And like, it's awful to realize as an adult what a deep impact it had and what a deep wound it created, something so silly. And, you know, it's sad because as kids at a school these days, we can be so cruel towards other kids without realizing the permanent damage that it can actually cause in the future, and, you know, that is going to dictate our lives later on. And Maggie, I love you to talk in a second about laughter. I know that I do with my ladies. I tell them to go and smile in front of the mirror for 1 minute and to time it, to literally grab the phone and put the timer on for 60 seconds where they're just doing nothing but smiling at themselves in the mirror. And I go, look, the 60 seconds is going to seem like 10 hours, you know, and if you haven't done it, but I promise you, just that movement of those muscles is going to release, you know, the endorphins that you need in your brain to start feeling good about yourself again. And, you know, some of them can't do it. Like they'll do 10 seconds and go, oh my God, that's ridiculous, Sandra. What a silly exercise. But I know you talk about, you know, laughter being something that can boost your immune system. So talk to me about that, Margie.
Oh, absolutely. There's quite a bit of research about the way that laughter, not just the changes in the muscles in our face, but we breathe differently when we laugh. You know, we tend to take in much more oxygen when we laugh. You know, there's a whole form of therapy called laughter therapy, where people meet together in groups and just laugh. That's what they do. And one of the other things that it does, it kind of stimulates memories. I mean, sometimes people, even when they laugh, they do get in touch with some deep trauma memories, you know, and it turns into tears. But, you know, I always say to my clients, you know, that tears are healing. You know, that it's our body's way of creating chemicals that are going to, you know, release what's been happening in our bodies. And there's actually, you know, some little exercises that we use in therapy with people that when the person laughs, you know, suddenly they relax a lot more. And so all of that's can only be beneficial for us, as is doing things, being creative, you know, anything that kind of takes our focus, that helps us to get into a different rhythm, that helps to slow us down, that helps to kind of, you know, get our breathing in a way, in a little more rhythmic way. All of that fine tunes the body to kind of counteract the effects of trauma as well.
Fantastic. I can see there's also some exercises. I just want to say, Maggie, that even though your book, you know, is titled Thrive Beyond Traumas, a guide for trauma workers and their managers, it's actually really good for any human being in the planet, because we are in charge of many other people, whether it's your own family and your kids, whether it's the people that you work with, whether it's just your friends and your loved ones. And by reading this, I realized, well, first of all, if you're officially caring for someone that had trauma, many times it's harder for the carer than for the person who had the trauma, because it puts a lot of emotional stress, because especially if you're a very caring person, like I know for me, if I'm trying to help someone, I can't help it but to take on their emotional burden. And then I've got to find a way to release it, because otherwise it's going to start affecting me as if it was mine. You know, the human brain many times doesn't know or doesn't distinguish what's reality and what's not. And like for kids, for example, many times parents don't realize they might be watching a movie that it's all about the war and shooting and all this, and the kids sitting there with the parents watching the movie, and the kid's brain doesn't realize what's reality and what's not. So the kid, if we were to monitor his brain, it starts to get distressed, because his brain starts to feel like he is part of it. He's there living the experience.
Living it, yes.
Exactly, even though, you know, we know it's not reality. So this is very important for us to learn, for any human being, like what are the things that we're exposing our kids to that we don't realize may be causing trauma, and that, you know, you're not thinking much of it, your partner is in the TV room, your kid walks in there, you don't realize, but it's causing trauma to the brain. And also how to prevent it, because by learning all the techniques that Margie talks in here about looking after ourselves and those that we love, you know, we are giving ourselves and those that we love better tools to handle day-to-day situations, to avoid them from becoming traumas that will leave wounds and, you know, will impact us later on. So I strongly recommend, if you don't have it yet, you have to head over to Amazon straight away and look for Thrive Beyond Traumas, from Margaret Bennett, because the amount of stuff that you're going to learn. And what I love is that it's one of those amazing little books, like 130 pages, because I don't know about you, because sometimes I pick up books that are over 300 pages and it's like, oh, I'm never going to read that. And but this is one of those that, you know, you go to bed at night, read it for a bit, perhaps the next morning or the next night, and you don't. And the amount of learning that you're going to do, it's amazing. Now, if you're like me, who are you're not a fan of reading because of, you know, my mind gets distracted very easily. I love doing audiobooks, and so we'll be working on that shortly, and you'll hear the voice of the actual Margaret Bennett reading this for you. I love doing that because I know what would take me a week to read, I can do it in a day or two, because I go to the gym, I'm cooking, I'm driving to pick up the kids, and I'm listening. So stay tuned for the audiobook version. So Maggie, tell me more about what are another couple of easy techniques that normal people who are not even working with trauma can implement in their lives to help themselves and help the people around them, or to help them prevent themselves from further trauma?
Well, I think it's a no-brainer these days. You know, you mentioned sleep earlier. Before, we do know that sleep actually helps our brains to process trauma. There are some ideas that, you know, some people will stop themselves from going to sleep because they have nightmares and dreams. In actual fact, that is just our body processing. And, you know, if you've got someone that you can talk to about those nightmares and dreams, it will also help you to get through them a little bit better and get good sleep hygiene. I think a lot of people don't realize that the way that they sleep is really important. You know, that having a dark room, being in a room that's cool is going to be more beneficial for our sleep pattern. And you're perfectly right. You know, sleep, the amount of sleep that people get varies. I think the other, you know, as we mentioned before, nutrition, looking after being careful of what I call the cats, not the furry creatures that we all love and adore, or some people hate, but looking after the parts of nutrition that can get in our way. For example, C stands for caffeine, A stands for alcohol, T stands for tobacco, S stands for sugar. So they're my version of the cats. That's not original. It was developed by another clinician, that idea of the cats. And, you know, caffeine, alcohol, tobacco, and sugar all impact the way that we become more anxious or more depressed in different ways. And so, you know, those are areas that we can actually limit or just look at to see if any of those are kind of impacting us a bit more. You said exercise really works for you. Yes, we do know that exercise really works in the brain. It's really helpful for people, particularly for people who are depressed. It helps the brain to shift and create different chemicals. But the other thing that is often under-recognized by a lot of people is talking to someone. And that can just be, you know, having a friend. If you don't have a friend, you know, you might go, that's why therapy works with people. That's why going and talking to someone works, because you have this kind of, you have this connection with someone else, and it begins to help you make connections in your own brain. But what about people that have no one around them? That's also true for some people. They actually don't have anyone to talk to at all. Some of the things that work for them is actually journaling. Having a journal, drawing your day, making a collage of your day, writing out what happened to you. There was a period of my life when I was a teenager where I was incredibly isolated, incredibly lonely. I had quite strict parents. We weren't allowed out very much. And I started diary writing. And although I'm not currently doing it now, I do have over 30 years of journals. You know, and it's interesting to me to go back and look at some of the stressful events in my life and how I got through them. But so writing a journal is another way that you can, that people can, you know, have that talking aspect, because you're kind of talking to yourself. There was some research done many, many years ago where they actually prove that if you write down for 10 to 15 minutes a day something in your life that impacted you and how it impacted you, that it actually changes your physical health. Now that's pretty amazing to do, just picking up a pen and writing down, this happened to me and this is how it's still affecting me, you know, can have quite magical results in people's lives. I think I mentioned crafts and, you know, and doing something that puts you into different frame of mind, listening to music that's uplifting. All of these also have the capacity to, you know, provide you with support when you're going through really tough stuff.
Wow, I hope you wrote some of those down, because Margaret amazing tools. And, you know, you're very analytical like I am. Using your creative side to engage the other side of your brain is very useful. Like I find I relax and I go into a completely different state because I'm used to using that analytical side of the brain, you know, so it puts me in a completely different mode. I know with my kids, if they start to get cranky and irritated and in a bad mood, I need to find them some creative activity, you know, a craft, something they do with their hands, creating a slime, painting, or whatever. I love the journal thing that you mentioned, Margie. It is so powerful. Just before you go to bed, if you get yourself into the habit of making it that the last thing you do for the night, just before, you know, your eyes close, it's a very good relief. And I have to say, there's something magical about using your hand and the pen on paper.
Yes.
Because as Margaret said, it can help create new wires in the brain. And so by putting it out, it's out of here into the paper. It's like if you just released it from keeping that stress, you know, it's like to-do lists. When you don't write them, they're just in your head consuming energy and stressing you. Same with situations that happened that day. It could be something that happened that was very exciting and brought a lot of happiness and joy. It could be something that was, you know, terrifying or stressed you a lot or upset you a lot. But by releasing it out, you're making sure that it doesn't create like permanent, you know, not damage, but permanent consequences of trauma stored into your brain. So I love your cat analogy, Margie. That was fantastic to remember what are the things that we need to look after. That is really, really good. So Margie, if anyone wants to, you know, learn more about this, whether it's seeking help one-on-one from you or just learning from you, because I know you're a fantastic teacher and facilitator. I know you've been in this industry for what, over 20, 25 years, Margie?
Oh, over 30 years, Sandra. I've been working with trauma survivors. Yes.
Amounts of experience. And as you just heard with Margie's story, like, you know, we need to have experience what we teach, because many times, you know, we can't teach something that we haven't even gone through ourselves because we don't even know what it's like. But you heard from Maggie, who very genuinely and authentically shared with us some very, very traumatic events that she's had throughout her life since childhood and as a mom. You know, who else is going to relate to what happens and how to heal herself? I mean, Margie is just a go-getter. Nothing stops this woman. She's a powerhouse and, you know, positive and energetic and wanting to help the world, and not just her family and those that she loves, but just people in general. Like Margie, it's all about service. And I admire so much that about you, Margie, because you're a strong man, you're resilient, you don't give up. And, you know, to come and open up your heart with us, your audience, and share all those amazing experiences. So if people want to work with you, either one-on-one to help them heal or to help them prevent trauma for them and their loved ones, or to get you to come and speak at their, you know, conferences or at their work, because I know you work with a lot of corporations, Margie, in, you know, teaching their staff and managers how to help prevent their workers from developing trauma in the workplaces, how to provide that, you know, healthy environment to prevent trauma. So how do we get hold of you if we want to work further with you, Margie?
Well, you can write to me at Margie at margiebennett.com. That's MARGIBENNETT. It's is my name. That's my email. That's probably the best way to get hold of me at the moment. I'm also on LinkedIn and Facebook and Twitter, on those kind of areas. I did have my own website up until a few months ago when it was hacked and it's been destroyed. So I don't quite know why it got hacked, some random thing. So, but I am in the process of working towards getting another one. So the best way to get me at the moment is through Margie that's M-A-R-G-I, no E on the end of Margie, M-A-R-G-I at margiebennett.com.
Nice. Margie at margiebennett.com with double N and double T. That's fantastic. Margie, thank you so much for your time. Thank you for writing this magical book that if you don't have it yet, you need to head over to Amazon straight away and type in Thrive Beyond Traumas by Margaret Bennett, because I promise you there are a few books that change your life, and this is one of them. Thank you so much, Margie. You've been a blessing. Thank you for serving so many people in this world. And I am truly grateful of having people like you who are always willing to help others and to help us prevent more damage in the planet. So thank you for being with us, Margie.
Yeah, thank you for the opportunity, Sandra. Thank you.